Welcome to our MidWeek podcast. These are conversations between pastors and theologians, members of our church staff, focused on our current sermon series and how we understand the purpose and the value of this particular series at this particular moment. So in these conversations, we'll explore why are we studying this text or this topic and why right now? How might this contribute to the faithfulness, discipleship, and formation of us as individuals and as a community? We hope you enjoy. Hi there. Welcome to our midweek podcast here at Mill Creek Foursquare Church. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Chris. And we are continuing our series of discussions on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is our current sermon series as a church. And so we're also exploring it a little bit in our podcast conversations. Pastor Trevor and I have already had a couple of conversations about Ezra and Nehemiah. We tried to kind of set the stage for the series a little bit, talk about why we might study these books, why now. We also talked a little bit about the structure and themes of the book. Even though Trevor and I have already covered this to some extent, I thought it would be really interesting, Chris, to get your take as well on these broad questions of sort of why would we as a church enter into a sermon series on these particular books. Why study Ezra and Nehemiah? Why now? And what might these particular books have to offer for our Christian discipleship, formation, witness in this particular moment that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, without question, it's the most unique season I've known as a spiritual leader. I've been in vocational ministry for 21 years, 15 of those here. And acknowledging that those first 4 to 5 years of transition, that those were pretty unique. Following another leader, new leadership is always going to introduce new challenges and benefits. But for our time here, I've never known a season like this. And I think most pastors, many pastors that are my elders, who've traversed this journey longer than I have, been in ministry 4 decades, they would tell you, I've never seen anything like this. Yeah. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah is a moment akin to that from our scriptures, from our sacred text. Like, we haven't really seen anything quite like this. And so, for the people of God now formed as the people of God, right? Now, when you go to Ezra and Nehemiah, you could hearken back to the Exodus for sure. And there are a lot of points of similarity. I mean, what would the people in Ezra and Nehemiah's day been kind of looking back to say, previously in our history, previously in our dealings with God, previously in our formation, our discipleship, our looking more like this God who chose us. What could we look back to and learn from the Exodus? They would have been looking at the Exodus. But I think one of the distinct differences is that was like the moment when it was new to them. Yeah. It was initial, right? Now you're well on into the story of the people of God. And everything that they had inherited that was started through the Exodus process now had been compromised.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And what do you do? I think this is one of the key questions I have, and I'm learning as much as anybody in teaching this, which is always the case. And I'm frankly really grateful I didn't tackle Ezra and Nehemiah, or better said, we didn't tackle Ezra and Nehemiah earlier, because I think I would have taught it differently. I think I would have seen it differently. And I think I'm just particularly grateful I'm seeing it through the moment we're in right now.
Sure.
And again, that doesn't mean it says more or less, but I think our eyes are trained a little bit differently. Our ears are open a little bit differently. So anyway, all to say, I think the people of God had huge questions based on exile, compromise, what of the promises of God, what of our identity. We don't get to worship like we used to worship, or now that we're trying to reinstitute, recapture worship as we once knew it. We have very similar questions to ask. COVID and all that it has contained has been cataclysmic. It has brought seismic change. We have been in the ice age of And we're not out of it, by the way.
Sure.
Local church ministry. No one alive has seen an influence, like what a shaping influence, a change element agent, like we've experienced the last 14, 15 months. Yeah. And who knows how much longer.
Yeah.
And all the learning, all the questions we have to ask. Who are we as the people of God? What do we do as the people of God? What's worth rebuilding, recapturing as it was? What needs to really change? What doesn't fit us any longer?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then maybe the question underneath all of those or above is, what is the sovereign God doing?
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I mean, I like the way that you framed that. There's a sense in which you seem to be speaking to a kind of nuanced, clearly in this moment in the larger biblical narrative, God's people are in what you could call sort of uncharted territory, right? Like you were saying, this is a kind of new moment with the kinds of questions that haven't been asked before in exactly this way. And yet you also are speaking to these elements of continuity, because as they're faced with this uncharted territory, as they're exploring what it looks like to be the people of God in the aftermath of this crisis, or what you call the cataclysmic event. I like that. It's uncharted territory, and yet they have a tradition, and they have, at this point in their history, at least some kind of sacred scripture type of tradition that's been developing. And so it's uncharted, it's new, it's sort of unexplored, and yet they have resources on which to draw as they seek to sort of explore what it might look like to respond faithfully, or to return and reconstruct and renew faithfully. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of framing how Ezra Nehemiah fits within the narrative, but also with all kinds of implications for what it might look like for us to engage with these texts now. Because I think the way you've framed our current situation is helpful too. It's, of course, probably no one could deny or disagree with the fact that this is uncharted territory, that we've faced a crisis that in many ways was unprecedented, and that even as we speak about recovering from it or coming out the other side, or whatever language we might want to use, there are aspects of it that might be appropriate, especially if it is the case that we're able to keep moving toward opening things up, returning to some semblance of normal, all of those things. But I think you also really helpfully articulated that there are all kinds of things that are just going to have a lasting change. Or things, maybe another way to put it is, there are certain things that just are going to have to change as we explore what it looks like to live on the other side of this. And some of those are really sort of practical things, like, everyone had to get a lot better at using sort of digital media in just about every facet of life.
For sure.
And so there will be lasting, lingering effects of that. But also, as you said, there are, for the people of God, for us as disciples of Jesus, for the church, there are lasting questions and concerns that go much deeper than just sort of how do we make sure everyone can hear the sermon on a Sunday morning and that kind of thing, right? There's these questions of identity, these questions of worship, these questions of what has this crisis revealed about what needs to be restored and renewed, and what has this crisis revealed perhaps about things that need to fall by the wayside, or even be more intentionally deconstructed. I think that's really helpful. Yeah. So in light of this, why Ezra Nehemiah? Why now? We've had I think you've framed it helpfully in terms of this kind of moment in the biblical narrative, this moment in the history of the people of God, and how there might be sort of parallels for us in our particular moment. So that suggests that there are parallels, there are analogies, there are elements of correspondence that we can draw on, and that dynamic often helps us to engage with the Bible, right? It's sort of like, okay, I can see parallels here, and it helps me to sort of find myself in the story or see how this story might inform my story, our story, that kind of thing. But there are also significant differences between our story, our situation, and Ezra Nehemiah, right? It doesn't take too long poking around in these two books to find that, okay, the predominant concerns are about rebuilding a temple, restoring animal sacrifices within a whole sort of sacrificial system, returning to a sort of liturgical calendar or a calendar of feasts and festivals within Jewish tradition, rebuilding the walls of a particular city within a particular land that's understood to be sort of God's dwelling place, all in the context of one sort of ethnic people defined as the covenant people of God, returning to this specific land with the temple. There's all of these dynamics that sort of, as we go through them, point by point, it's sort of like, well, for us as Christians in the 21st century, it's sort of like, well, we're not an ethnic people. We're not defined by a land or a city. We don't worship at a temple. We don't do sacrifice. So how might you help us to wrestle with sort of, there's parallels, there's analogies, there's all sorts of ways this text might speak to us, but there's also distance and difference. And like, how do we engage with a book that has these concerns at its center as Christians and sort of make sense of it?
It's such a good question. And I think it's really fundamentally been one, even from the earliest Christians, we've been asking, right? Why did Paul write what was written earlier was done so for our instruction? Right? It's Scripture is this both and dynamic, because clearly what was written in ages past, let's just say the Torah, was written very specifically for a very specific group of people in a specific time frame to address very specific things. Paul, however, then said what was written before was written for our instruction. So Scripture has this constant instructional nature about it. The people of God can always learn and grow from it. But the differences are profound. I mean, you've pointed them out in the questions. Well, let's just take the temple, for instance. They're rebuilding a temple for worship. We are the temple of the living God, whereby communion happens, initiation and response, right? Worship is response. So, profound difference. So we go back and well, then, honestly, what can I learn from a people who are trying to rebuild a physical temple when now we understand image bearers are the temple of the living God? I actually think Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Old Testament text is profoundly helpful for us in that. Why would I say that? I tend to think that there is a fundamental, dare I say, even a fostered misunderstanding about the Hebrew Scriptures. I think even in us just calling it the Old Testament, I mean, even in just the name. Old suggests I don't need that anymore. The new is the thing.
iPhones, computers, so many of the things we interact with. What is old at this point in our history, even by a few months or years, quickly becomes sort of obsolete. And what is new is what we really want. And so the language can...
I don't even like using it. I use it because it's what people understand. But if I have a choice, I will always say the Hebrew Scriptures.
I like that. John Goldengay, the Old Testament scholar, he calls it the First Testament.
See, I like that
as a way of
better.
trying to sort of, and it's unfamiliar, and maybe sometimes it's jarring. Like, wait, what do you mean? Because we're used to Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, but it helps to jar us out of like some of those potential assumptions and misunderstandings associated with referring to it as old.
And I think some of our fundamental, or as I said, fostered misunderstanding is we get lost in the form to the point that we negate the heart of what was going on between God and Israel.
That's good. It's helpful.
I really think that we just tend to look at law as form, however many 600 and some odd particular in points of instruction or command. And I think in my early years of Christian living, listening to the teaching, there was this construct like Israel just couldn't bear up under the law. They just couldn't do it. when in Deuteronomy it says you can do it. So what is it?
Yeah.
And I, the more studying I've done, the more learning of the culture I've done, I'm certainly no expert, but it would sure seem to me that it wasn't so much a construct like we can't do it, but it was more the focus over the form instead of the substance. Where did the Pharisees get in trouble? Part of it was an over-obsession with form and a de-emphasis of substance.
Sure.
Right? There are other things going on there as well, but that's part of the picture, right? And so I think for us, we look at temple or we look at law. And so what's going on with the rebuilding of the temple? Was it just, hey, God needs a house because he's not happy if he doesn't have a house?
Right.
I think there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. And it doesn't take very much reading in the Old Testament to see there's already a very nuanced theology of divine presence throughout the Old Testament. It's not as if the Old Testament just has this one sort of narrow view of kind of like, well, God has to be physically in this house and that's where his presence is or something like that. There are passages that seem to suggest his presence was somehow physically, literally manifested in these spaces like tabernacle and temple. But then there are also all sorts of passages that complicate that picture and sort of ask these rhetorical questions like, can God really just be contained in a place like this? Of course not, right? The heavens are his throne. The earth is his footstool. There's the passages like Ezekiel 8 through 11, this middle portion of the book of Ezekiel that has like the Spirit of God sort of departing, or the glory of God, the kavod of God departing from the temple. There are so many sort of portions of the Old Testament itself that already suggest it's not as if there's just this sort of naive ancient understanding of a God dwelling in this space and in this space alone. There's a nuanced sense of, in a way, this sacred space really matters, and God chooses to make himself known in this way, and yet it's not as if anyone was assuming that God could just be somehow sort of contained or managed in that way.
Yeah, I like the challenge is connecting the dots, right? And that was what your question was about. How do we connect the dots, right? So in the just finished teaching, by the time this airs, I just studied Ezra 4. I'm about to teach on Ezra 5. But in Ezra 4, you have this conflict that then becomes generational. So they're carrying out they've laid the foundation of the temple. They're starting actually to construct temple, and everything goes haywire. And what do we make of? So how do we connect the dots? What do we make of God promising and God moving a foreign power that foreign powers had historically been opposed towards, but now they're very favorably disposed towards.
Yeah.
And so everything's lining up. Puzzle pieces are fitting together. And they still couldn't do it. There was opposition, there was problems, there was human frailty. However we read the text, bottom line, they couldn't move into the fullness of the purpose. And doesn't that feel so much like where we've been living? So much.
Yeah.
And what do we make of everything we've seen in terms of infighting in the church? Because it's real.
Sure.
What do we make of culture war between church and larger culture? It's all in some form or fashion right there in Ezra 4.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot, so tons of differences, but it's not that hard to start connecting the dots and seeking to garner wisdom, right? If these things really happened, but they were penned, they were written down, not just to tell a story, but actually so that the Spirit of the living God could instruct us through it. What can we gain from this? Yeah, there's a lot we can gain.
No, that's good. I think the image of connecting the dots is probably a really helpful one for us to dwell on, right? Because yes, we've talked about the fact that there are vast differences between not only our time and culture and the one that we read about or encounter in Ezra Nehemiah, but also even our sort of structures of worship, our ways of relating to God and understanding God. There are massive differences, but we've also traced these elements of continuity and similarity and sort of analogies between their situation and ours. And so I think connecting the dots in a careful way is maybe exactly what we do as Christian readers of Old Testament books like this. We kind of go, well, yeah, clearly the task before us is not to rebuild a temple. And yet, in the same way that God's presence in the midst of God's people was central to the identity of the people of God before and after the exile, God's presence in our midst is central to sort of who we are as followers of Jesus. And so we need to sort of attend to those realities. We don't observe Torah or law in this precisely the same way as the ancient Israelites did. And yet, Israel's Torah remains sacred scripture for us. And this whole newer or Second Testament we also have to shape us. And so in a similar kind of way, when faced with uncharted territory, when faced with cataclysmic events, crises, and their aftermath, we have a tradition that we can draw upon. We have scriptures, we have the story and the witness of previous generations facing their own crises that we can draw upon for wisdom, discernment, guidance, these kinds of things. So yeah, I really like that language of sort of, or the image even, of trying to connect the dots. Not to say this is exactly the same, so we just read exactly what they do and then interpret it in the sense of sort of, go and do likewise, right? We don't do that, but we also don't just say, well, that was a different time, different place, different way of doing things, so we'll just kind of figure this out on our own. Yeah. It has to be something in between that, right? Where we wrestle with both.
Absolutely. And, for me, speaking very personally as a shepherd in Jesus, a spiritual leader in a moment of crisis, I think one of my primary takeaways from my fresh study of Ezra and Nehemiah is just how complex this all was. Because I know I am serving in a profoundly complex moment. It is the proverbial damned if you do, damned if you don't, stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't think I've ever known a leadership moment I know I haven't known anything quite like this. Any which way you turn, there are landmines to step on. Yeah. And so in the complexity of all of that, what I also see, not just is the complexity of the situation, but how that complexity impacted the leaders. And not just Ezra and Nehemiah, right? But Zerubbabel, Yeshua, the high priest, the discouragement that settled on them that caused so much delay, the need of prophetic ministry to bring renewed focus or energy, just a reviving of the hearts of the people. To go, we're still here, the window's still open. Yeah. And then you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, who did something so well, but in both books you read of things and I've always read them and you just scratch your head. You're like, well, I don't know what to do with that. Yeah. And I think as a leader, I actually find comfort, but I also find fresh grounds for the needed humility. I think that I want to carry as a spiritual leader, but that I really want the people of God to hold on to with me. Which is like, where did we think we're going to get everything right? Yeah. Where did we pick that up? Like I want to walk this out. I think humility lets somebody do things more right than wrong in the kingdom. I think that's what Jesus teaches. But we're still frail. Yeah. And we're not going to hit a home run on every time we come up to the plate. I think 5-10 years from now, we're going to look back and go, man, we did this really well. And this, And I guess I'm saying I expect that. I don't expect to hit a home run in this moment at every turn of the bend. Prayerful, humble. If there's anything I want to get right, it's the honoring of people. Yeah. But yeah, I think the complexity of the situation that led to the complexity of choice on behalf of leaders, and just recognizing like they made some really good choices, and then they made some that just really leave you going, I don't know.
Yeah. Wow. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I feel like what I'm almost hearing you saying is that it could be that the complexity of these books or this narrative, and maybe even the complexity of our current situation as Christians trying to navigate what it looks like to follow Jesus right now, can be understood as a gift. Not to the extent that sort of we ignore the actual difficulties, but there is a sense in which, if all the Bible was kind of like simple to understand commands that you go and do this, or sort of nice encouraging words from the Psalms, or if that's all the Bible was,
or stellar exempling.
Sure, yeah, moral exemplars that don't have any kind of rough edges or ambiguities. Yeah, that would be nice. But I mean, I
wish I was that way.
If that's all the Bible was, it wouldn't take very much for us to kind of be like, yeah, I think I know what it says. The issue is now just going to do it. But at times really pressing into like, this is a complicated narrative. I don't actually know what's going on in it, what I'm supposed to take away from it, or what the Lord might be speaking to us in and through it right now. And then even for our current moment, to sort of think about the complexities of it as not necessarily a wholly negative thing, but kind of like, I wonder if when we're in moments where we think, maybe as individuals or collectively as the church, I wonder if moments or seasons where we kind of think everything's working and we've got it together and we kind of know what to do, I wonder if at times those are the most dangerous places for us to be, because we aren't probably being formed in a kind of humility, and we aren't being faced with the necessity of sort of discernment and the reality that you spoke of, that like we might look back on this season and wonder, oh man, maybe aspects of what we did were the right choice, the right direction, a faithful witness, and maybe some of the choices we made could have been tackled differently. I wonder if seeing some of these elements of complexity not solely as negative, but in some sense as part of what God has for us in this season. Yeah.
We probably don't have time to dive into this fullness. So who knows? Who knows what our next podcast will be? Well, I think one of the interesting things to learn from Ezra and Nehemiah, why did Israel go into exile? What was the prophetic, clearly declared primary reason? Idolatry. And covenant unfaithfulness. And so as the people are returning to the land with the purpose, promise of God attached to it, and not just the God of heaven, but the king of the land at the time, favorably disposed towards, when that happens, what you see is, oh gosh, the idolatry that got us here, it's actually still really hanging around. Yeah. And it's almost like as soon as the people get back in the land, they kind of go right back to it. And I think that dynamic, like again, this has been cataclysmic, meaning it's forced change. There is no response but change to this. We don't have the option to just go back.
Right.
We're different. Life has happened. So I think COVID has exposed a great deal. Whatever it's exposed about the world, fine. I mean,
sure.
I think I care far less about that, if I'm honest. I care a great deal about what I think we're starting to see about the people of God today.
That's good.
And our duplicities and our loyalties, and really honestly, how much we hold on to that isn't gospel, isn't kingdom, isn't Jesus, isn't his way, isn't his will. And I have a lot of questions. I'm very uncertain we'll actually get on with Jesus the way this might suggest we ought to. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah is a moment when you just go, whatever getting on was done, there was also some really holding on to old. And I'm not saying holding on to, I mean, there's some right holding on to old.
Certainly.
I'm not suggesting holding on to old is exclusively bad.
Certainly.
No, not at all. But there were patterns of behavior that led Israel to where they got. And shockingly, generations later, those patterns were still pretty ingrained. Yeah, I think we have a lot of learning to do.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Our podcast is produced by Dave Sproul. It's edited by Tim Muchira, and we have music from Sherry Muchira. If you're enjoying these conversations, we'd love to hear from you, so please subscribe on whatever platform you're using, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you.